19, verse 22, which is a long passage, and we'll break it up as we go. For those of you who are watching at home, and for those of you who maybe came in a little bit later, today's sermon is going to be the final for my Bible study methods class. It's an elective I teach every other year, and this year, instead of doing 12 to 20 page final, which I don't understand why the kids didn't want to do that, but they chose not to, and they said, can we actually just write a sermon instead for you? I said, that sounds great. And I said, in fact, not only is that a good idea, but I'm actually going to preach your sermon on a Sunday morning, and I'm going to let my church give you the grade. So, Oliver, your grade is in their hands. And I did say, Oliver asked, and I think this will tell you everything you need to know about this young man. He said, if we show up as a class, can we get extra credit? And I said, sure. And so I was going to divide it up between who all came. So now you get 100% of it. So great. So our text today, like I said, will come from John 18, starting in verse 28. And before we begin, I have a PowerPoint. So the focus of today will be Jesus is King. And to begin our story, or to begin the sermon, there's a popular story that we're all aware of, and it takes many different shapes, and it's told throughout history. But it's a story of a victorious king who sits on his throne, and his people live a life of peace. He lives a life of peace. He's wealthy, he's safe, he sits on his throne unchallenged. And as he begins to think about his reign, for him, it's not sufficient that he live in security and peace. He desires for his people to live in security and peace. And so one thing that the king will do is he will go out and he'll live among his people. He might wear a disguise, and he rubs shoulders with them, and he sees what it's like. What does it look like for my people to live in my kingdom? And he's concerned, do they have a good education? Do they have good water and food? Are they employed well? Do they have hospitals where they can be taken care of? And do they have something called livelihood? And so the king goes out, he evaluates what his people are like, and then he decides, what can I do to help them become better people? The story that I think of, and I know that some of you are familiar with this, is the story of Aladdin. How many of you guys are familiar with Aladdin? Aladdin is a great example of this, with Princess Jasmine, who sneaks out of the palace often, and she dresses in rags, and she goes to the marketplace, and she rubs shoulders with her people just to see what life is like in her kingdom and ways that she can make it better. And we all know different stories like this. You could, if you want a masculine answer, what about Aragorn and Lord of the Rings, the king who refuses to be king because he wants to help people be victorious over evil? And there's something about these stories of this powerful king humbling themselves to see what life is like for his people that resonates with us. And I would suggest the reason it resonates is because in all of these stories, they echo the biblical story where we have this king named Jesus who sits enthroned with God the Father forever, living in holiness, living in power and glory. And just like the kings of all these other stories that we've read about, at some point Jesus says to himself, I wonder what life is like for my people. So Jesus leaves his throne and becomes human to discover what it's like to be human. And so as we look at our story, we'll see that Jesus is just like the king who sacrifices his comfort and his safety by leaving his palace, going out and helping people. We also see that Jesus sacrifices himself completely to the point of death to save his people by getting rid of the sins that ruin our lives. So our text for today is going to look at four main sections. We're going to look at, is Jesus King of the Jews? And this is what's fascinating. Is Jesus the King of the Jews? The next section, Jesus is crowned King of the Jews. 3, is Jesus King of all authority? And then fourthly, Jesus is king, or Jesus is enthroned as King of all authority. So in our first section, hopefully this works. There we go. The first section we want to ask is this: is Jesus the King of the Jews? So let's go to our text, and we're going to start in verse 28. Then the Jewish leaders took Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. By now it was early morning, and to avoid ceremonial uncleanness, they did not enter the palace because they wanted to be able to eat the Passover. So Pilate came out to them and asked, "What charges are you bringing against this man?" "If he weren't a criminal," they replied, "we would not have handed him over to you." Pilate said, "Take him yourself and judge him by your own law." But we have no right to execute anyone, they objected. This took place to fulfill what Jesus had said about the kind of death he was going to die. Pilate then went back inside the palace, summoned Jesus, and asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "Is that your own idea?" Jesus asked. "Or did others talk to you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate replied. "Your own people and chief priests handed you over to me. What is this? What is it that you have done?" Jesus said, "My kingdom is not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." "You are a king then," said Pilate. Jesus answered, "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into the world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." "What's truth?" retorted Pilate. With this, he went out again to the Jews gathered there and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him. But it is your custom for me to release to you one prisoner at the time of the Passover. Do you want me to release the king of the Jews?" They shouted back, "No, not him. Give us Barabbas." Now, Barabbas had taken part in an uprising. And so our first section that we look at, Pilate asks Jesus the simple question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" Jesus responds by basically asking, "Is this your idea, or is this what other people say about me?" And you're just kind of quoting what you've heard them say. Then Pilate says, "Am I Jewish? Your own people and your chief priests hand you over to me. What is it you've done?" Basically, Pilate says, "I'm not Jewish. I don't really care about what you guys have to do. I'm just confused why your people brought you to me." And one of the interesting points that the guys in the class pointed out that I never really thought of is the contradictory nature that the chief priests have with Jesus. Pilate asks him if he's a king, and we kind of see this confusion with Pilate that for someone that, we see throughout the whole Gospels that the Jews constantly, or the Jewish leaders constantly refuse to say that Jesus is king and that he's God. And yet time and time again, they treat Jesus as if he was the greatest celebrity in the world. I mean, most of the conversation that Jesus has with people is because the Pharisees and chief priests surround Jesus and ask him tons of questions. So it's almost like they're the ones building his celebrity status. And so Pilate's kind of confused. These guys constantly say that you're not king of the Jews, and yet they give you the attention that a king would get, and they're constantly surrounding you. They're constantly asking you questions. And I would compare it to this. This is not in what they wrote. I came up with this illustration on my own. It's kind of like, how many of you guys know a little boy, maybe preschool, elementary school, maybe middle school, maybe high school, and that little boy, there's a little girl. And this little boy constantly pesters that little girl. And what is the question that we typically say when a little boy pesters a girl? We typically say that little boy, he's in love. He likes that. And what does the boy typically say when you ask that? They say, "No." And we're like, well, you spend an awful lot of time with that person pestering them. It seems as if you like them. And so it's kind of the same thing. The religious leaders constantly reject Jesus as king, and yet they're constantly going to Jesus to ask his opinion on stuff. That seems like they're kind of saying, in a way, Jesus, you're kind of like a king. And so Pilate's super confused, and he's like, "Are you the king of the Jews, or are you not?" And notice how Jesus answers. And this is a fascinating way. Jesus doesn't say if he's the king of the Jews or not. All he simply says is this: "My kingdom's not of this world. If it were, my servants would fight to prevent my arrest by the Jewish leaders. But now my kingdom is from another place." Jesus admits to being a king, but notice he doesn't admit to being king of the Jews, which raises the question, why in the world doesn't he just say yes? Because we know, if we've read the Old Testament, Jesus is the one who's in line with David's lineage, isn't he? And he's with David's dynasty. Yet Jesus kind of ignores it and just says, well, my kingdom's not here. So what does that mean? Jesus says this: "You say that I'm a king. In fact, the reason I was born and came into this world is to testify to the truth. Everyone on the side of truth listens to me." And this is where Jesus answers the question, "Are you the king of the Jews?" And Jesus says, well, hold the phone. My kingdom is not what you're thinking it is. And my kingdom is not comprised of either the Jewish people or the non-Jewish people. My kingdom is comprised of all those people who hear the truth and respond to it. And it raises the question, well, do you mean the Jewish people? Or if the Jewish people respond to what truth is, the answer is yes, they're part of my kingdom. Well, what does that mean about those who are outside of your kingdom, like the Romans? What if a Roman is on the side of truth? And Jesus would say, yeah, that person's part of my kingdom. In fact, we see Jesus going throughout the whole Gospels, going to people that are not part of the Jewish nation. He goes to the Syrian Phoenician woman north of Israel. He goes east of Israel to the Greek cities of the 10 cities, and he finds the guy that we would call Legion, who's Greek, and he heals that guy. Then he goes to the Roman centurion, comes to him, and that represents people from the east. And so we see people from all over, and you could say you didn't say south, and I would say you're right. But it is interesting to me that there's a huge story in the book of Acts where an Egyptian comes up, or an Ethiopian comes up, and that person is from the south. So by the end of Acts, a person from every direction surrounding Israel has come to understand who Jesus is. And so when Jesus hears this question, are you the king of the Jews? The answer is, it's more profound than that. Jesus says, this isn't about ethnicity. This is about, have you understood the idea that I'm king, and have you embraced me? Because for the Jewish people, they saw Jesus as one who's just simply here to fulfill prophecy and reestablish the kingdom of Israel. And Jesus says, this is not what I'm meant to do. I'm here to draw all people who embrace truth into this. And so notice what Pilate says in verse 38. Pilate asked Jesus, what is truth? And this is one of those times that sometimes the Bible is not helpful like we want it to be. And what I mean is this. In Leviticus chapter 19, In Leviticus 19, God says, be holy as I'm holy. And we would expect when God says to be holy that he would tell us what holy is. And yet he doesn't. It's like he forgets. God says, I want you to be holy as I'm holy. Well, what does that word mean? And God's like, next section, please. Here's a list of ways to love your neighbor. And here's a list of ways to love me. And we're like, wait. You said be holy. We were hoping for a definition, and said you skip it and you just start listing ways to love people and love God. What does that have to do with holiness? And God would say, that is your definition of holiness. If you want to be holy, love God and love other people. So here we say Pilate asked, what's truth? This is an opportunity for Jesus to say, I'm glad you asked. But notice Jesus doesn't give a definition of truth here at all, does he? But it's interesting. I think we're going to see in this passage that Jesus is going to answer that question, just not in a way that we're going to maybe want to hear how Jesus answers it. So let's go to our next section. This is starting at 19, verse 1. Then Pilate took Jesus and had him flogged. The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and put it on his head. They clothed him in a purple robe and went up to him again and again, saying, Hail, King of the Jews! And they slapped him in the face. Following his discussion with Jesus, Pilate then immediately takes Jesus out to have him flogged. And then to further add to the humiliation, the soldiers that are around Jesus make a crown of thorns, put it on his head, and they give him a purple robe, which you guys know that a purple robe is a sign of royalty. And then they begin to say to him, Hail, King of the Jews. And what's ironic about this is, even though the soldiers mean this to be an act of humiliation, this is indeed Jesus truly being crowned king. This is him being enrobed in his clothing. And these praises that they say mockingly truly are the praises for Jesus. And so we kind of see something interesting. Pilate says, what's truth? We might expect Jesus, because the whole theme of John is, one of the themes is what's truth. Jesus never really answers that in a way that we might want him to. But notice what immediately follows. What's truth? Jesus goes out and Jesus is crowned. And then Jesus offers himself as a sacrifice and as a service. And so in some ways, Jesus is answering this question, what is truth? Well, here's one aspect of truth. Jesus is king, and he has his kingdom. A second aspect of truth is the following, that Jesus' kingdom is a kingdom of sacrifice and service and of love. And so Jesus humbles himself for the whole world to see, and Jesus invites us to embrace that kingdom. All right, that was point 2. I didn't click. Clicker, work. There we go. Jesus is crowned King of the Jews. All right, next section, Nicholas. Let's pick up in verse 4. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I'm bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here's the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify, crucify." But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to the law, he must die because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid, and he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free, but the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend to Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was the day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here's your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, take him away, crucify him." "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priest answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. We see in our passage that it begins with Pilate asking the simple question, "Is Jesus King of the Jews?" And we see that Jesus does not say yes or no to that specific statement, because as we see through this passage, Jesus is king over all those who embrace truth. And we might have the natural question, does this mean that Jesus is only king for those who have embraced truth? Is Jesus king over those who do not embrace the truth? And we see in this passage that the answer is that Jesus has all authority. He has all authority over all the Jewish people. He has all authority over all the churches. But for that matter, Jesus has authority over all living things. Pilate says to Jesus, "Don't you realize that I have the power to free you or to crucify you?" And Jesus answers, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." I enjoy this idea in a way that it's intriguing to see how Pilate would have responded. So I was thinking about this week. I'm going to pick on Mitchell because everyone knows Mitchell. Imagine Mitchell gets in trouble at school, and Mr. Peach, the principal, comes and says, "Mitchell, I need to see you in my office." So Mitchell goes to his office, and Mr. Peach says, "Mitchell, you have done something I'm going to have to give you a violation. In fact, I'm going to have to give you a detention. In fact, we may even have to kick you out of school." And then Mitchell looks at Mr. Peach and says, "Mr. Peach, you're only going to kick me out of school if I allow you to." And we're like, oh my word. And yet this is basically what Jesus says to Pilate. Pilate says, "I represent the full power of the Roman Empire. Whatever I say today is what they would say." So just keep in mind, Jesus says, you have no idea. You would have no power to do anything if I didn't give it to you. And so when we look at this passage, we see that Jesus is saying that he has a power that goes above and beyond just this authority over this little Jewish nation. Jesus is saying, I have all power over all things. When we see Jesus crucified, that he shows us that he has power over time itself. And one of the interesting things about the Gospels is the closer we get to Jesus's crucifixion, the more rapidly we see that phrase in accordance with prophecy, or there's tons of scripture references. And it reminds us that as Jesus is dying on the cross, as Jesus is being buried, as Jesus is being sealed in the tomb, all these things are going according to how God chose for it to go. Like, there's no surprise here. And it's showing that Jesus has full control over time and space. So is Jesus king of the Jews? Well, those who have embraced truth and those outside of the Jewish nation who have embraced truth, Jesus has authority over all peoples. Jesus now has authority over all time and all space. And Jesus has authority over all political powers, that there would be no political power that can rise or fall without Jesus saying it's allowed to happen. And I thought of this last night. This is a sneak preview for my sermon before Voting Tuesday. So the sermon before Voting Tuesday, we will probably come back to this idea. Who controls all political power? It is Jesus. He is the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. And the closer we get to election time, I think the more the church needs to be reminded of that. But notice that when Jesus says, my power comes from above, and Oliver, I kind of want to say, was this your point? Not to bias you guys, but the guy is right here. One of the things that Oliver pointed out, and I thought this was fascinating, was this. Jesus doesn't say that his power is from heaven, which is what we would expect him to say. Or in John, Jesus constantly says, my power, or this comes from the Father. And yet here he says, it's just from above. Well, what does that mean? And I think it's interesting that there's almost a vagueness to it. And I think Jesus is getting at this idea that when we talk about political power, and Randy and I, before service, this is not in his, so it's like, how could he know Randy and what happened? This is an aside. Before service, Randy and I watched a video on the effects of World War II in the church. It was a fascinating video. But before the video played, there was a political commercial. And you guys know that usually the January before the election year, two things happen magically. One, political commercials are going to be everywhere, and gas prices are magically going to start going down. Anyway, in the political, and I won't tell you what side of the spectrum this political commercial was, because the reality is it doesn't matter, because they both say the same thing. In these political commercials, they say, we have to have all the control. We have to be the ones calling all these shots. And that's how earthly power is, isn't it? It constantly wants more, and it constantly grabs on. But notice when Jesus has power and control, what does he do? Jesus dies for people. He serves people. So when Jesus says, I'm from above, it's not just his location is from above. Jesus' understanding of priorities and reality and truth is from above. It's not the way that we think of power. It's not the way that we think of truth. Jesus, the whole understanding of his kingship is completely foreign to us as humans. Understandably, the Jewish leaders have had a very difficult time with Jesus through the whole gospel, because he butts up against everything they believe. The Jewish leaders are constantly, what do they constantly desire? They constantly desire control. And constantly Jesus is showing them that they are not the ones, they're not God, they're not the ones who created the law, but indeed Jesus was. In fact, this message of do we embrace Jesus as king or not is so difficult for the Jewish leaders to hear, that ultimately they decide the only way to deal with Jesus claiming to be God is to do what to him? Peanut butter to the throat, as some would say, is to kill Jesus. They reject Jesus and his message and his authority, and they decide to kill him. And it's interesting, how do they respond? They show their complete alignment with the worldly system of power, and they say to Pilate, if you let this man go, you're no friend of this earthly system of government. And then at the end of it, they show their allegiance when Pilate says, isn't Jesus your king? How do they respond? We have no king but this earthly system of power. That's fascinating to me. Like, we have nothing to do with God. We have nothing to do with Jesus. We fully embrace how things are on earth. And so we go to our last point. See if it's up there. There we go. Jesus is enthroned as King of all authority. When we first started this assignment, I was gone the day they picked this passage. So I said, why don't you guys spend the day coming up with a passage? I thought, surely these guys will pick a psalm. The Psalms are the easiest thing in the world to do. And I come back and I'm like, okay, what'd you guys pick? And I wish Eli was here, because Eli freaked out. And he just kind of pouted in the corner. And I was like, what's wrong? And he's like, they picked 2 chapters to do a Bible study on. And I freaked out, because I was like, there's no way I'd ever preach this whole thing in one sermon. But what's interesting is, since we were confronted with this large section, it's fascinating to me to see how this progresses. Pilate asked Jesus, are you king of the Jews? And the next thing is, Jesus is crowned king of the Jews. Like, there's no more question. It's like, are you the king? Let's crown you. The next question is, are you king of all authority? The next section, he is enthroned as king of all authority. So let's go to verse 16, part 2. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus, carrying his own cross. He went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with 2 others, one on each side and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews. Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be King of the Jews. Pilate answered, what I have written, I have written. We see in our passage that Jesus was crowned, Jesus was robed, Jesus was praised, but now we see Jesus take his throne, and his throne's a little bit different than we thought. We may have thought Jesus' throne is going to be this luxurious throne and it's going to be glorious, but ironically, at the end of this passage, Jesus' throne turns out to be the cross. He's lifted high for all people to see. And if this is Jesus' throne, and this is an example of what his kingdom and kingship looks like, that raises a lot of questions. What does it mean to follow a king who dies sacrificing and serving for other people? What are the implications of whether he's King of the Jews or not? So the first thing that we notice in this is the following is, and I want to give credit to Colson. That's one of the guys who wrote this one, because I thought this section was interesting. You'll notice when Jesus is in a lot of these kangaroo trials, he doesn't say anything. Like, he refuses to talk to the high priest. He refuses to talk to Herod. Depending what gospel it is, dictates how much he talks to Pilate. And you kind of get the idea. Jesus isn't going to answer their questions. And this is what Colson writes. So, and I quote, it's degrading for Jesus to answer him because he's made it so abundantly clear throughout his whole ministry. Jesus has constantly proven who he is. And it's not that they want Jesus to prove that he's God. They want to dictate what Jesus does and where he does it. Like, there's an example in the Gospels where Jesus has just healed someone of, I want to say he heals someone from being demon possessed. The Pharisees show up and they're like, just give us a sign. And he's like, I literally just gave you a sign. And it's not that they want a sign. It's that they want control of when Jesus does the signs, when and where and how he does it. And so what Jesus is showing them is that he doesn't answer these kind of obtuse questions because it's degrading. Like, you know the answer to this. And as Colson says, this is not what I write. So if this is offensive, you have to blame an 18-year-old kid. He says any educated person is going to come to the conclusion that Jesus is exactly who he claims to be, which I thought was a pretty good quote. Or as Dr. Tsoukalos would say in seminary, Jesus cannot be reasonably ignored. You can ignore him, but you're ignoring a lot of things that most people would say have to be true. And so Jesus reminds us that his kingdom is not of this world. If it were, he would have his people come up. And interestingly, it's not that Jesus is saying, I would have angels come fight for me. He's referring to his disciples. If I operated like you guys operate, I would just tell my literal physical people followers, let's rise up and attack these people, because that's how the world works. If you don't like how things go, rise up against them. But notice in Jesus' kingdom, what does he do to defeat his enemies? He sacrifices and serves and shows his love. He shows that his kingdom is a kingdom of humility and service. Secondly, Jesus demonstrates his kingdom and his kingship by carrying his cross to death. One of the things I did point out to the boys is you should never bring up things at the end of your sermon that you've not already talked about. It's time to start wrapping it up. It would be the equivalent of, let's say you've had a meal and you have this. Let's say we go to a fancy restaurant. And some of you will judge. This is not what they did. This is me. So don't judge Oliver. Don't judge the other boys for being weirdos. This is me personally. When I go to a fancy restaurant, sometimes they have those little jelly packs. This is how I start my meal. I grab one of those strawberry jelly packs and I open it. And that's like my pre-meal warm-up. I grab a spoon and I eat it. And it's just saying, get ready, stomach. This is just a foretaste of glory divine. Following that, then the drinks come, and if it's a really fancy restaurant, you'll get some kind of free thing, maybe bread, maybe a salad, who knows. And then the meal comes, and then you eat the meal, and you're like, oh, I'm so stuffed. I can't possibly eat anymore. And they're like, do you want dessert? And if the person's paying, I'll say, yeah, sure. And so then, depending who it is, and if I like them or not, and I know, and I'll be like, yeah, let's get a dessert. Imagine when the dessert comes out, though, like, You've already ordered it, and as the brownie covered in ice cream and caramel syrup's coming out, hopefully a cherry on top, they're like, oh, before your ice cream comes out, we have another plate of food for you. Oh boy, that's a good way to say it. I was gonna say, oh my word. I don't know if that's kind of how it is with a sermon. Once you get past your main points, it's time to start wrapping this up with dessert. And Colson's like, let's just bring out another meal. And I said, please don't do this. It's not, but I think we have to, because the way that this passage flows, the initial question that Pilate wants answered is Jesus king of the Jews? How does Jesus answer that? I'm not king of the Jews. I'm king of all those on the side of truth. I'm king of time because I'm fulfilling all these prophecies that were given before. I'm king of all earthly powers. But notice this, by going to the cross and dying for our sins and suffering for humanity, Jesus is showing full and complete authority over death itself, that he is the king of death. He is the one that death tried to conquer. What does Jesus do? He conquers death. He's victorious over it. We see that Jesus dies for people's sins. So guess what else? Jesus says, I'm king of I have authority over these things, and that is also our sin. We see that the evil one, whose kingdom is represented by Caesar, Jesus conquers the evil one's kingdom. So throughout this whole passage, Jesus takes this simple question, are you the king of the Jews? He doesn't specifically answer that question, but through the whole passage, he's routinely showing us that he's king of the Jews, the Gentiles, all powers, all authorities, all time and space, king over death itself, king over the evil one's kingdom, and all these things, systematically showing that he has all authority through all time and all space. And so this raises the question, if Jesus is the king of all things, what does that mean for you and I? One of the things that we do in Bible study methods classes, we have what we call an application chart, and it makes application super easy. And it's broken into 9 boxes. And the first box simply says, what is the problem that the people in our passage have? And the problem is they need a king. In fact, if you were to say, Jeff, what is one of the major themes of the Old Testament? I would say a major theme is we have a people group looking for a king. That's one of the themes of Judges. We need a king. One of the themes of the books of Kings is we're trying to find the right king who will do the right thing consistently. We see all the way back in Genesis chapter 1, God promises you will have a victorious child who is going to conquer evil once and for all. And from that Genesis 3:15, throughout the whole Old Testament, we're looking to see who this is. Is it Moses? No, Moses died. That's not good. Is it Joshua? No. Is it David? No. Is it? And we just go through the list. And so the next question is, the problem for them was that they needed a king. They were looking for a king. And the solution that God gives is God sends his son Jesus to be king over all things. The last question that we have, so first it's, what is the problem that the people have in the text? How does God solve that problem? And then the last one is this, how do people respond to that problem? We've been looking for a king for thousands of years. God finally gave us Jesus. And how do they respond to Jesus? They reject, at least in this passage, they reject Jesus' kingship and authority, and they try to establish themselves as kings. The next section that we look at is, now that we know that, we have to ask the question, what's this like for people today? So what is the problem of people that are living in America today? And we want to stick with the text. Would we say that the same problem is we have people looking for a king? Now, we might not say king because we're not familiar with kingly language, but what if we say it this way? We live in a culture where people are looking for identity. Would you say that is everyone? Why am I here? What's my purpose? What defines me? What gives me a reason to get out of bed every day? And I would say the reason we struggle with that is because we have the same problem the Israelites had. We are a people looking for a king. And then the next question is, well, what's God's solution to that? Well, here's the easy part. If God's solution in the Bible times was to send Jesus as our king, God's solution today is that Jesus is our king. That Jesus is the one who gives us identity and purpose and meaning. And then it raises the question, well, what do we do with that? If Jesus is our king, how do people today receive that? And if we look at how did people in the Bible times receive that, we see they don't necessarily receive it like we want them to. Like they reject that. And so today we have people trying to identify, or people trying to find identity in any number of things. And I think we talked about this last week in Romans. As people, we're strangely stubborn. And sometimes that's good. And we have people that have these beautiful stories of just overcoming the odds. But for the most part, our stubbornness often causes us more spiritual difficulty than it should, because we know that God is the only one that defines us. And yet often, what do we try to do? We still try to find something in our life that is not God to define us. And we could even ask the question, what are things in our culture today that people try to identify themselves with? Maybe they say, I'm my job. And we see people spending weird, insane numbers of hours at work because if I can just have the best job imaginable, then I'm going to find my true purpose in life. And when they do, they are still miserable. Or what are some other things? You guys can interact if you want to. What are some things that people use to identify themselves in our culture? Sports. Oh my word. Ruth and I were talking about this today. People go in like the craziest weather, half naked, painted all these colors to match their team. And it's like, you're insane. Like if you did this anywhere else, we would call you nuts. Why are you wearing all these collars? And why are you wearing horns on your head? You're a weirdo. Oh, I'm going to a football game. Oh, that's fine. I didn't realize. You should have started with that. Like if you would have said I'm going to be half naked sitting in a football stadium with a bunch of other half naked people, I would have said, great. I thought you were going to Walmart, you weirdo. P.S. Do not go to Walmart half naked. I do have an interesting story about that I'll tell you over lunch downstairs for $5. I'll tell you. All right, so what did I say? Jobs. Randy said sports. What else do people say? This is what defines me in our culture. Mitchell's giving me the eye that says I want to answer, but I don't want to answer right now. Mitchell? Politics. Oh, my word. Our identity is summed up in politics. And unfortunately, I think the church has embraced that in a lot of ways. Yeah, my political beliefs define who I am. And I've even heard Christians say this. If my political party doesn't get in office, and I quote, there is no hope, end quote. As long as Jesus is king, we have hope. Oh, my word. So politics, sports, jobs, what else? Social media. Am I liked or not? Do I have so many likes? Absolutely. And people's lives are ruined by social media, or people's lives are given purpose by social media. But guess what? What's popular today will not be popular tomorrow. You're chasing after a ghost, or as Ecclesiastes says, you're defining your purpose by a vapor in the wind. All right, what else? So we have social media, jobs, sports. Randy's saying money. He gave 2. Yeah. What kind of car you drive? Yeah. I gave up on that one, Shelby. I said, we're just going to go with these old, as long as it gets me to Walmart so I can see the half. Don't even say it. You'll get fired, man. All right. Nick, give me another one. Relationships. Are you in a relationship? And we could even expand that further if we wanted to, but I'll save that one for maybe later. Yeah. Are you in a relationship or not? Who do you like? Who do you not like? It sounds like high school, doesn't it? All right, Mitchell, were you going to say another one? Being right. Oh, my word. Being right. I have to be defined. And even if it costs me all my relationships, I have to be the right one. Absolutely. Now, there's a difference, I think, between being absorbed in truth, which is what Jesus calls us to, versus the need to always be right. What else? Anyone else have one? Let's say the awkward one that our culture is obsessed with, but no one wants to say in church because we're all good Christians. Isn't our culture obsessed with sex? Like we would say, my whole identity is bound in what I do with my reproductive organs. Is our culture obsessed with that? And our culture is obsessed with labels. Like everything gets labeled. Are you a boomer? Or are you a millennial? Or are you Gen Z? Are you trans? Are you bi? Are you straight? Are you cis? CYS, in case you want to look it up later. I'll help you out. Are you white Anglo-Saxon? Are you Hispanic? Are you Native American? And I think that includes Alaskan too. I forget what the charts. We love to label people, don't we? Because we love to find out how people identify themselves. And so Jesus says, in all the ways and shapes and forms in this world, if you try to define yourself by the ways of this world, it's going to leave you broken and ruined. And so as I told my class, you can do the greatest Bible study in the world. And it could be a 12 to 20 page Bible study. But if you leave the last step out, you failed not just yourself, you failed the text. And the last question is this. What is the problem for the people in the Bible? How does God solve their problem? And then how do they respond? Next section. How do people in this world, what's our problem? Next, how does God solve that problem? And then lastly, how do people respond to that? But here's the final questions that we have to ask. And if we skip this one, we failed. What's my problem? The problem back then is they needed a king. People's problems today is they need a king. What's my problem? I need a king. And we have to each ask ourselves this question: what king do we individually follow? Randy would say those other people follow sports. Mitchell would say those other people follow the need to always be right, and so on and so forth. But if we ignore this question, we have left here as fools. What is it that I call king of my life? Maybe it's anger. My anger defines me. I've been angry so long, and it determines every decision I make. Or maybe it could be popularity, like Nick said. I'm all about being popular. And if people don't like me, my life is ruined. And I have to chase after popularity. Maybe it's sexual identity. This is a huge one in our culture. I need to be in the right group, and I just got to understand, what do I do with my body and all my innards and all this stuff, and just constantly wrestling. Who is it that is our king? What's the solution we have? Well, Jesus confronts that, and Jesus says, whatever you call king, it's going to let you down when you need it the most. I'm the only king that has authority over absolutely everything. And so the question is this: what do we do with that when we're confronted with, what is it that you worship more than anything else in your life? And then we hear that Jesus is the true king. What do we do with that? Historically, when we read, especially John 18 and 19, when Jesus says that he's king, do the people embrace that in 18 and 19? They don't embrace it at all, do they? In fact, they say, Jesus, we'd rather kill you than call you king. When we look at our culture today, when Jesus confronts all these identities of everything that we've listed, do most people embrace Jesus as king? And Jesus tells us, wide is the road that leads to destruction, and the road that leads to the kingdom of God, it's super narrow. So things aren't looking too well for us. People back then rejected Jesus' kingship. Majority of people today reject Jesus' kingship. But the last section we need to ask is this: do you and I reject Jesus' kingship? Do we call him the king of our life? I've shared this story before, and I'll share it again. Oliver, I know you know this because I told this day one of Bible class. When I taught college courses, I taught Bible study methods at the college level. It was my favorite class to teach. And here's the good news: no one else liked teaching it. So every time it came up, I'd sign up for it, and I always got it. And it's like, Jeff, why do you always, or Professor Rogers, why do you always teach this course? I'm like, well, because no one else wants to teach it, and I need the money. But anyway, I was teaching the course one time, and this one was a super small class, like 5 people. And the first week we get in the class, and there's a girl, we'll call her Claire. I have no idea what her name is. And every week, Claire's like, I'm going to fail this course. I'm going to fail this course. I'm going to fail this course. I don't know how to study the Bible. And so week 2 shows up. I'm like, Claire, why do you keep saying that you're going to fail this course? And she says, well, I'm not a Christian. And since I'm not a Christian, I can't study the Bible. And I said, Claire, that's preposterous. Like, the whole point of this class is to teach anybody how to study the Bible. And you don't have to be a Christian to understand the principles that we're going to look at. And so I'm going to fail this class. I'm not a Christian. So finally, week 3 shows up. And I say, Claire, every week you've said you're going to fail the class because you're not a Christian. I feel like you want me to ask you this question. Claire, why aren't you a Christian? And Claire says this: I'm not a Christian because I know exactly what that means. In order to be a Christian, Jesus has to be king of your life. I'm okay with Jesus forgiving my sins. I don't want him to have control of my life at all. I want to be in control. I said, thank you, Claire, for your honesty. I don't know anyone that would be that honest. But I think she has a point. That when it comes to Jesus forgiving our sins, how many of us are cool with that? Man, I'd love to go to heaven when I die. The idea of being burned in hell, that sounds miserable. But the idea of giving absolute control of our entire life to Jesus, that's scary. Because when Jesus says, I want you to give me everything, he means our need to be right. I need you to give me your desire to always be the smartest person in the room. I need that. Your dedication to sports. I need you to give me your dedication to sports. And I want you to be dedicated to me more than that. Or as Nick said, popularity. I need you to desire me more than popularity. I need you to desire me more than your sexual identity. I need you to let me be the king of your entire life. And so the question that we have, and as we close, is this: what do we do with Jesus' kingship? We see the Jewish leaders reject Jesus' kingship. But what's interesting is by rejecting Jesus, what have they proven? They've proven that he's still king, regardless of if they embrace his kingship or not. And so for us today, I would ask you this: what is the king in your life? And I would even ask this: if you have a bulletin with you, I would like you to do this. I'd like you to take the bulletin, because I want us to be completely honest with ourselves. Is just find your bulletin, and if you're sharing a bulletin, rip it in half, give it to someone else, and share it or something. And what I want you to do on that bulletin, and you can even do it in secret. So sit like this. What I want you to do is on that piece of paper, I want you to be honest with yourself. And I had a friend who said this. He would say the worst person that we can lie to is ourselves. We can lie to God, but guess what God knows? God knows the truth. And we can lie to each other, but if you know someone well enough, you can tell when someone's lying. That's why I don't play certain card games with my wife, because she's like, Jeff, you're lying. And it's like, I know. But the worst person to lie to is ourselves, because out of God and other people, who can we trick the easiest? We can trick ourselves the easiest. So what I want you to do is in secret. You don't have to show anyone, and don't be nosy. Don't be that person. I want you to write on that paper, what is truly the God of your life? And if the answer to that question is legitimately Jesus, great. I'm happy for you. I'm proud of you. But if the answer isn't Jesus is truly the king of my life, just be honest with yourself and say, this is exactly who's King of Kings in my life. And as you write the true king of your life, my next question would be this: how is that done? What has that done for you? Has that brought you the peace and the security that you need? Or does it continue to say, if I could just get a little bit more of this thing, if I could just have a tiny smidgen more, I think that would finally bring me peace. And the reality is it's not brought you peace up to this point. It's probably not going to bring you peace at any point. With that, let's close in prayer, and then we'll dismiss. Jesus, we think of how this passage starts. It starts with Pilate simply asking a question: are you the king of the Jewish people or not? We see, Jesus, that you don't answer him directly, because you're more than just king of the Jewish people. You're king of all those who fall into truth. But you're more than just king of those who embrace the truth. That Jesus, you are the king of all earthly powers and authorities. You are the king of all time and space. You are the king of death and life. You are the king of forgiveness. You are the one who has conquered the kingdom of the evil one. And so, Jesus, today, as we think about what we wrote, God, my prayer, my hope, my longing is that everyone in this room wrote, Jesus is truly the king of my life. God, that I would praise you. And God, I know that there probably are some people who wrote that because they're truly dedicated to you and they follow you. But God, I think if most of us were honest, we would say, Jesus, you're not truly the full king of my life. There's something that I hold on to. There's something that I grab with the dying arms of a dead person. Just beg, God, you'll have to pry this from me from my dead, cold hands. And Lord, we turn to whatever this is. Maybe it's money, maybe it's power, maybe it's popularity, maybe it's sex, maybe it's drugs, maybe it's cars. Lord, it could be any number of things. And God, we are so creative at worshiping God, we literally worship stones. That's how dedicated we are to trying to fill your kingship with stuff. Lord, for those today who say to themselves, Jesus, I don't think I worship you completely as the king of my life. Lord, I pray that you would help them. I pray that, God, they would say, Jesus, will you destroy this false idol in my life, and will you be truly the king of my life? God, I pray that you would give them the strength that they need. I pray that, God, you would minister to them. God, help them to find freedom from whatever this is that defines their reality and draw them close to you. God, we praise you. We thank you. We glorify you. In Jesus' name, amen. Can we close with a song? Would that be okay? All right, will you guys stand with me? I'm going to sit down there and look this way so you don't have to listen to me sing. And Nick, if you could pop that on front. I think most of you